May I eat your leftovers?
That depends. What will you do if I say no?
I see you have found yourself unusual company for dinner.
Miss Alaric was hungry. I offered her my plate.
I should return to my duties.
Sit.
Inside that drawer is the truth my father took to his grave.
Then we open it tonight.
Once we do, there is no returning to the lives we had before. Your Grace, she is under arrest. Release her from your grip this instant. Forgive me, my lord.
The fork trembled in her hand before she even touched the plate. Marcella Alaric had not eaten in 3 days. Not properly. A heel of stale bread was stolen from the scullery bin on Tuesday. A spoonful of cold porridge meant for the hounds on Wednesday. Tonight her stomach had stopped growling hours ago and gone silent in that particular way that frightened her more than the hunger itself. The silence of a body beginning to give up. She was not supposed to be in the East Dining Hall. She was not supposed to be anywhere near the Duke's private table, with its candlelight and its silver and its half-eaten roast pheasant abandoned on a porcelain plate, because His Grace, Duke Killian Ashgrave, had been called away mid-meal by some urgent dispatch from the capital. The footman had cleared the room, or so she'd thought. Marcella's fingers closed around the edge of the plate. Her hands were shaking so badly the silverware rattled, and the sound of it was obscene in the marble silence of the hall, a confession before she'd even committed the crime. "May I eat your leftovers?" The words left her before she could stop them. Not asked of anyone, not really, just spoken aloud the way the starving sometimes speak to God, or to no one, or to the universe that has decided to forget them. She didn't expect an answer. She got one. "That depends," said a voice from the shadow of the far doorway, low and unhurried, "on what you intend to do if I say no." Marcella froze. The plate slipped half an inch beneath her fingers before she caught it. Her whole body went rigid, every instinct screaming at her to run, to drop to her knees, to beg, and beneath all of it, a colder, more dangerous thought. "He's seen my face. He'll know me now. There is no undoing this." She turned. He was not supposed to be here. He was not supposed to have come back. Duke Killian Ashgrave stood in the doorway with his coat still half unbuttoned, the dispatch he'd been called away for crushed forgotten in one fist. His dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. Not the fury she braced for, not the disgust she expected, but something quieter. Something that looked, absurdly, almost like recognition. He was younger than the portraits in the East Corridor suggested. Younger and harder, with a jaw that looked carved rather than born, and a stillness to him that unsettled her more than shouting would have. The whole palace whispered about him. The Iron Duke, they called him behind gloved hands. The man who had buried his father, his mother, and his only sister within the same bitter winter, and had not shed a single visible tear at any of the 3 funerals. A man who ran his estate like a battlefield and his household like a regiment. A man, the older servant said, who had not smiled since before Marcella was hired. He was not smiling now, but he was not summoning the guard either. Marcella's voice cracked. She set the plate down with exaggerated care, as though gentleness now could undo the trespass already committed. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I'll go. I didn't mean. I thought the room was empty. I would never. Sit down." The 2 words landed like a verdict, and for one terrible second she thought she'd misheard him. Thought sit down was some cruel preamble to and wait for the constable. But he had already crossed the room, already pulled out the chair across from his own abandoned plate, already set it at an angle that was, she would realize only later, lying awake replaying every second of this, an invitation rather than a command. "Your Grace, I couldn't possibly. You were about to eat off my plate with your bare hands a moment ago." His tone was flat, almost bored, but his eyes had not left her face. "I find it strange that propriety only occurs to you now." Heat flooded her cheeks, shame so total it felt like drowning. She wanted the marble floor to open beneath her and swallow her whole, wanted to be anywhere, anyone, except a starving maid caught with her fingers on a duke's pheasant in the dead quiet of his private hall. But beneath the shame, something else stirred, a flicker of indignation she had no business feeling toward a man who could have her dismissed, imprisoned, or worse with a single word to his steward. "I was hungry," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "I am not ashamed of being hungry, Your Grace. I am ashamed of where you found me hungry." Something shifted behind his eyes. It was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. A flicker, a crack in the iron, gone before it could be named. "Sit," he said again, quieter this time. "That is not a request I intend to repeat a third time." She sat. Her legs had carried her there before her mind had finished deciding to obey, and she lowered herself onto the velvet-cushioned chair as though it might bite her, spine straight, hands folded in her lap to stop them shaking. The Duke did not call for a footman. He did not ring the bell at his elbow. Instead, with a kind of deliberate, unhurried precision that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't understand, he took the plate of pheasant, his plate, untouched by anyone but his own fork moments earlier, and slid it across the white linen until it rested directly in front of her. "Eat," he said, "properly, with the fork. I haven't touched the meat, only the bread, so you needn't worry about courtesy toward my leaving." Marcella stared at the plate as though it might be a trap. Perhaps it was. Perhaps this was a cruelty dressed in kindness, the kind powerful men sometimes enjoyed. Feed the starving girl, watch her gratitude, then decide afterward whether mercy or punishment amused him more. "Why?" she whispered. "Are you doing this?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she finally looked up from the plate and met his eyes directly, which she knew, even as she did it, was a transgression no maid should commit against a duke. His gaze held hers without releasing it, dark and searching, as though he were reading something written beneath her skin. "Because," he said finally, "I have buried 3 people I loved in the past 2 years, and not one servant in this house has had the courage to tell me the truth about anything since. You just told me you were ashamed of where I found you, not that you were hungry." He paused. "That is the first honest sentence anyone has said to me inside these walls in longer than I care to admit." Marcella did not know what to say to that, so she picked up the fork because it seemed safer than speaking, and she ate, slowly at first, with the trained restraint of a girl who had learned the hard way that eating too quickly on an empty stomach only brought it all back up again, and then faster, helplessly, as hunger overrode every careful instinct she had. The Duke watched her eat in silence. He did not look away, did not pretend to busy himself with the crushed dispatch still in his fist, did not offer the practiced indifference that men of his station usually showed toward servants. He simply watched, with an intensity that should have frightened her, and instead, inexplicably, made the marble room feel less cold. "What is your name?" he asked, when her fork finally slowed. "Marcella, your grace. Marcella Alaric." Something moved behind his eyes again at the surname. Quick, sharp, gone before she could read it properly, like a shadow crossing water. "Alaric," he repeated, very quietly, almost to himself. "That is not a common name in this region. My mother was not from this region, your grace. She came from the eastern provinces before I was born. She died when I was young. I don't know much more than that." "You don't know much more than that," he echoed, and there was something strange in the way he said it. Not disbelief, exactly, but a kind of careful, deliberate weighing, as though he were filing the information away somewhere it would matter later. "How long have you worked in this household, Miss Alaric?" "8 months, your grace. And in 8 months, no one has fed you properly." It wasn't a question, but she felt compelled to answer it anyway. "The kitchen staff eat after the household is served, your grace, and by then there is rarely—" She stopped herself. This was dangerous ground, the kind of honesty that could cost a girl her position, or worse, could cost the head housekeeper hers, and Marcella was not cruel enough to want that, whatever Mrs. Brennick's faults. "Rarely what?" "Rarely enough," she finished carefully. "It is not unusual, your grace. It is simply how a large house runs when there are many mouths in a few hours." The Duke's jaw tightened. She watched it happen, watched the muscle there flex once, sharply, like something restrained snapping taut. "It is unusual in my house," he said, as of tonight. Before she could ask what he meant, the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and a woman swept in with the particular brisk authority of someone who owned every room she entered without needing to be told she did. Marcella recognized her instantly. Lady Faustine Calderon, the Duke's betrothed, or as good as betrothed, a match arranged by both families before either party had been old enough to object, and rumored throughout the household to be as cold as her name was beautiful. Lady Faustine's eyes swept the scene in half a second. The Duke, the maid seated at his table, the plate between them, the unmistakable intimacy of 2 people who had been speaking quietly in candlelight. Her expression did not change, not visibly, not in any way a stranger would have noticed, but Marcella, who had spent a lifetime reading the small cruelties hidden beneath polite faces, saw it, the flicker of calculation, the recalibration. "Killian," Lady Faustine said smoothly, gliding closer, her gaze never quite leaving Marcella's face. "I didn't realize you'd returned, and I see you found yourself some unusual company for dinner." "Faustine." The Duke's voice had gone flat again, the warmth Marcella hadn't realized was there until it vanished. "Miss Alaric was hungry. I offered her my plate. How charitable of you." Lady Faustine's smile was a beautiful, bloodless thing, all teeth and no warmth, the kind of smile Marcella imagined a wolf might wear if it had learned to imitate kindness. "Though I confess I'm surprised. You've never struck me as a man overly concerned with the comfort of the staff. Perhaps you don't know me as well as you assume." The words landed with a quiet edge that made Lady Faustine's smile falter, just barely, just enough for Marcella to see it crack before it was smoothed back into place. "Perhaps not," Lady Faustine said softly. Her eyes moved to Marcella again, slower this time, more deliberate. A measuring look, the kind that catalogued a person from hem to collar and filed away every weakness it found. "Alaric, was it? An unusual name. I don't believe I've heard it before." "It is my mother's name, my lady," Marcella said, rising quickly from the chair, every instinct screaming at her to make herself small, unremarkable, forgettable. "I should return to my duties. Forgive the intrusion." "Sit," the Duke said again, and this time the command was clearly not for her benefit, but for Lady Faustine's, a quiet assertion of whose table this was, whose hall, whose decision it remained to make. Marcella hovered, caught between two wills she had no power to refuse, until the Duke's eyes flicked to her, softer than before, almost apologetic. "Finish your meal, Miss Alaric. I'll have a word with Lady Calderon in the corridor." He rose. He did not touch Lady Faustine, did not offer his arm, simply walked toward the doors with the expectation that she would follow, and after a beat that felt deliberately, dangerously long. She did. But not before her gaze found Marcella's one final time, and in it Marcella read something that chilled her far more than hunger ever had. "I will remember your face," that look said, "and I will not forget what I saw tonight." The doors closed. Marcella sat alone in the vast candlelit hall with a half-eaten plate of pheasant in front of her and her heart hammering hard enough that she could hear it in her own ears, and she understood, with the sudden clarity of someone who has just stepped off solid ground, that something in her life had shifted tonight in a way she could not undo and could not yet understand the shape of. 3 days passed before she saw him again. In those 3 days the household buzzed with a quiet, dangerous kind of gossip, the sort that traveled through scullery and stable in whispers too careful to be overheard by anyone who mattered, but loud enough that Marcella caught fragments of it everywhere she went. The Duke fed a maid from his own plate. Lady Calderon left in a temper before the second course. Mrs. Brennick has been asking questions about the Alaric girl's family. That last fragment troubled her most. Marcella had grown up with almost nothing solid to hold. A mother who died when she was 6. A string of relations who passed her between households like an inconvenient parcel. And finally this position, secured through a reference she'd never quite understood the origin of, written by a solicitor she'd met only once. In a meeting so brief and strange, she sometimes wondered if she'd imagined it. She knew almost nothing about her mother's life before her birth. She knew only the name, Alaric, and the faint, persistent feeling, carried since childhood, that there was something about her own history that others knew and she did not. She had not expected that feeling to follow her into the Duke's dining hall. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Brennick summoned her to the housekeeper's office with a face like a closing door. "His Grace has requested," Mrs. Brennick said, each word measured out like coins she resented spending, "that you be reassigned, effective immediately. You are to serve as upstairs maid to the East Wing, with direct duties in his private study and quarters." Marcella's stomach dropped. "Mrs. Brennick, I never asked for. I am aware of what you did and did not ask for." The housekeeper's eyes were sharp, assessing, not unkind exactly, but not warm either. The look of a woman who had survived 30 years in service by reading every shift in the wind before it became a storm. "I want you to understand something, Miss Alaric, because I do not believe anyone else in this house will trouble themselves to say it plainly. Whatever attention His Grace has shown you, it is not a kindness. It is a complication. Men of his station do not raise servants to their table because their hearts are moved. They do it because something has caught their interest, and interest from a man like the Duke is rarely without cost, to him or to whoever has caught it." "I didn't ask for his interest," Marcella said again, quieter this time. "No," Mrs. Brennick agreed. "I don't imagine you did. That rarely matters." She held Marcella's gaze a moment longer, something almost like pity flickering across her weathered face. "Be careful, girl. Lady Calderon is not a woman who forgives easily, and her family's influence reaches further into this house than His Grace's title alone would suggest. There are debts, arrangements, things settled before you or I had any say in them." She straightened a stack of papers with unnecessary force, a clear dismissal. "Report to the East Wing by noon, and Marcella, watch yourself in that study. His Grace keeps things in there that are not meant for servants' eyes." Marcella left the office with her pulse thudding strangely, equal parts fear and something she refused to name, something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. The East Wing study was unlike anything Marcella had seen in 8 months of polishing silver and turning down sheets. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, heavy with leather-bound ledgers and books in languages she couldn't read. A great oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface scattered with maps, correspondence, and a single framed portrait turned face down, as though someone had laid it there deliberately to avoid looking at it. She was dusting the lower shelves on her second afternoon in the role when she found the locked drawer. It wasn't hidden exactly, simply a drawer in the desk's side cabinet, smaller than the others, fitted with a brass lock that didn't match the aged ironwork of the rest of the furniture, as though it had been added later, deliberately, by someone who wanted this particular drawer kept separate from the rest. She should not have touched it. She told herself that even as her fingers found the small brass keyhole, even as curiosity, old, persistent, the same curiosity that had kept her awake as a child wondering why her mother flinched at certain names, certain places, overrode every instinct toward propriety she possessed. The drawer was locked. Of course it was locked. She withdrew her hand, ashamed of the impulse, and turned back to her dusting just as the study door opened behind her. "Miss Alaric," she spun, heart lurching, certain for one terrible second that he had seen her hand on the drawer, that this was the moment everything unraveled. But the Duke's expression carried no accusation, only a tiredness she hadn't noticed in the candle-lit dining hall, the particular exhaustion of a man who carried more than his shoulders were built for. "Your Grace, forgive me, I didn't hear you enter. You're settling in well, I trust." He crossed to the desk, loosening the high collar of his coat with one hand, and for a moment he looked less like the Iron Duke the household whispered about, and more like simply a man, tired and alone in a room full of other people's secrets. "Mrs. Brennick tells me you've caused no trouble. I try not to, Your Grace." A faint, almost smile touched his mouth, there and gone, like the flicker she'd seen across his face that first night. "That's a pity. I find trouble considerably more interesting than obedience." He glanced toward the desk, toward the face-down portrait, and something tightened in his expression before he looked away again, deliberately. "Has the staff treated you fairly in the days since?" "Some more than others, Your Grace." It was as honest as she dared to be. "Lady Calderon, you mean?" It wasn't a question, and Marcella found she had no good answer that wouldn't sound either like a complaint or a lie. So she said nothing at all, and the silence apparently told him everything he needed to know, because his jaw tightened in that same restrained way she'd noticed before. "I will speak with her," he said. "She has no authority over the household staff, whatever she may believe to the contrary. Your Grace, I don't wish to cause friction between you and Lady Calderon on my account. I am only a maid. It would not be, you are not only anything, Miss Alaric." The words came out sharper than he seemed to intend, and he paused, visibly recalibrating, his hand flexing once at his side before he continued, quieter. "Forgive me. I only mean, I have spent 2 years being told what I am owed, what is expected of me, who I am meant to marry and why, and in all that time, no one has asked me what I actually want. You asked me nothing that night. You simply told me the truth about your hunger and your shame, without artifice, without asking anything of me in return. I find that I have not been able to stop thinking about it." Marcella's breath caught. The room felt suddenly smaller, the candlelight from the window catching something raw and unguarded in his expression that she suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to see. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am a servant in your household. Whatever you think you saw in me that night, I would ask you to remember what I am and what I am not. I know exactly what you are." His eyes held hers, steady, unflinching, dangerously warm. "I am simply no longer certain it is what everyone in this house insists you are. Before she could ask what he meant by that, before the strange electric tension building in the small room could resolve into words either of them might regret, the study door opened without a knock, and Lady Faustine Calderon stepped inside with the particular cold precision of a woman who had been listening at the threshold longer than either of them realized. "Killian," she said, her voice silk over steel, "might I borrow you for a moment? Privately." The Duke's expression shuttered closed, the warmth retreating behind iron in the space of a single breath. "Of course." He turned back to Marcella, and something passed across his face too quickly for her to name. Regret, perhaps, or warning. "Finish here, Miss Alaric. We'll speak again." He left. Lady Faustine lingered a half-second longer in the doorway, her gaze sweeping once more across the study, the desk, the face-down portrait, and finally, deliberately, the small locked drawer Marcella had been standing beside only minutes before. "Curious girl," Lady Faustine murmured, so quietly it might have been meant only for herself. "I do wonder what you think you'll find in this house, Miss Alaric." Her eyes lifted, met Marcella's directly, and the smile that followed held no warmth at all. "Some doors are locked for very good reasons. I'd advise you to remember that, for your own sake, if nothing else." She left without waiting for a reply, the door clicking shut behind her with a sound that felt, to Marcella, disturbingly final. Alone again, Marcella stood very still in the center of the study, her heart pounding, the locked drawer seeming to pulse with significance in the corner of her vision. Whatever was inside it, Lady Faustine knew. And whatever Lady Faustine knew, she had just made very clear that Marcella was not meant to find out. The household's whispers grew louder over the following week, the way whispers always do, once they've been given a thread to pull. It was the head cook, Greta, broad-armed and soft-hearted in a way the rest of the staff rarely were, who finally told Marcella the story properly, late one night in the kitchen while the rest of the house slept. "You don't know about his sister," Greta said, stirring a pot of cooling broth more for the comfort of motion than any real need. "Lady Ondine, sweetest girl this house ever held, before the fever took her, or so we were told." Something in the way she said, "or so we were told," made the back of Marcella's neck prickle. "What do you mean?" Greta glanced toward the door, lowering her voice further, the way servants did when a story had teeth. "There was no body, child, not one any of us were permitted to see. Lord Ashgrave, the old Duke, his Grace's father, sealed her coffin before it ever left her chamber, saying the fever had disfigured her too badly for viewing. Buried her in a single afternoon, no proper mourning, no procession through the village, the way the family always did for their dead. 2 months later the old Duke himself was gone, and the Duchess within the year, and the new Duke, our Duke, has not spoken his sister's name aloud in this house since the day she was put in the ground." She set down her spoon, her eyes distant with old memories. "There were some of us back then who thought it strange. A girl that young, that beloved, gone and buried before half the staff even knew she'd taken ill. But it isn't our place to ask questions about the dying of nobles, is it? Never has been." Marcella sat very still, the broth forgotten, a cold unease settling low in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. "Why are you telling me this, Greta?" The older woman studied her for a long moment, something careful and not unkind in her expression. "Because you've got his attention, girl, whether you sought it or not, and a man's attention in a house with secrets, this deep is not a small thing to carry." She picked the spoon back up, resuming her slow stirring, her voice dropping to barely more than breath. "And because, if I'm honest, there's something about your face that's been nagging at me since the day you arrived. Can't place it, just a feeling." She shook her head, as if dislodging the thought. "Old woman's foolishness, probably. Go on to bed, Marcella. Tomorrow comes early." Marcella climbed the narrow servant's stair to her small attic room that night with Greta's words circling in her mind like smoke that wouldn't clear. "Nobody. Buried in a single afternoon. Something about your face." She lay awake long past the hour she should have slept, staring at the low, slanted ceiling, turning over every strange detail of the past 2 weeks. The Duke's flicker of recognition at her surname, the locked drawer, Lady Faustine's pointed warning, and now this, a sister who may or may not have died the way the household had been told. It was nearly midnight when she finally drifted toward sleep, and it was the soft, deliberate creak of her door that pulled her back from it. She sat upright, heart hammering, certain for one wild moment that it was the Duke himself, come to finish whatever had been left unsaid in the study. But the figure in her doorway was smaller, cloaked, female, and gone again before Marcella could fully see a face, leaving behind only the faint scent of something floral and expensive that did not belong anywhere near the servants' quarters, and a small folded note left on the floor just inside her door. With trembling hands, Marcella unfolded it. Ask her about the locket she wears beneath her collar. Ask her why she never removes it, not even to bathe. And ask yourself, Marcella Alaric, why your mother's name sounds so very much like the name of a girl this house was told to forget. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Marcella sat frozen in the darkness of her small attic room, the note trembling in her fingers, the household around her finally deeply silent, and somewhere below, in the east wing, a single candle still burned in the Duke's study window, as though he too were unable to sleep, as though some part of him already sensed that the carefully buried truths of his family were about to claw their way back into the light. Marcella did not sleep again that night. She sat by the small attic window with the note pressed flat against her knee, reading the words over and over until they no longer looked like words at all, only shapes, only threats, dressed as questions. Ask her about the locket. Ask why your mother's name sounds so much like the name this house was told to forget. Below, in the east wing, the Duke's candle had finally gone dark some time past 2, and Marcella had watched it die from her window with the strange, unsettled feeling that somewhere in this house, 2 people were lying awake with the same fear keeping them from sleep, and neither of them yet understood why. She told no one about the note, not Greta, who had already given her more truth than was safe for either of them to carry. Not Mrs. Brennick, who would have likely seen it as confirmation of every warning she'd already given. She folded it small and sewed it into the lining of her apron pocket, where it sat against her hip for the rest of the week like a stone she couldn't put down. It was 4 days later, while delivering correspondence to the Duke's study, that she found the courage, or perhaps simply the recklessness, to ask the question the note had planted in her. Your Grace. She set the letters on the corner of his desk, careful not to disturb the maps spread across its surface. May I ask you something that isn't my place to ask? Killian looked up from his work, and something in her tone must have caught him, because he set down his pen entirely, giving her his full attention in that unsettling, deliberate way he had, as though nothing else in the room existed once he chose to look at someone properly. You may ask. I make no promise of an answer. Lady Calderon, does she wear a locket beneath her collar, where it wouldn't ordinarily be seen? The question landed harder than she expected. The Duke's expression didn't change, not visibly, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way water goes still right before it's disturbed. Why do you ask that? I don't know, Your Grace. It's a strange thing to wonder, I'll admit. She hesitated, weighing how much to reveal of a note she didn't fully understand herself. Someone suggested I ask you. I didn't think it wise to ignore the suggestion. Someone. His voice had gone careful, measured, the tone of a man choosing each word as though it might detonate. Who? I don't know who, Your Grace. They didn't stay long enough to say. He rose from the desk slowly, crossing to the window, his back to her, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply stared out at the grounds with his shoulders set in a way that suggested he was fighting something internal, something old. Yes, he said finally, quietly. She wears a locket, gold, oval, on a chain too fine to be comfortable. She has worn it every day since I've known her, and she has never once opened it in front of me, nor explained where it came from. He turned back to face her, and the look on his face was something Marcella hadn't seen from him before. Not coldness, not the iron control he wore like armor, but something closer to dread. Why does this matter, Miss Alaric? What has someone told you? That the name carved inside that locket, if it could be seen, might explain why my mother's surname unsettled you the first night we spoke. Marcella's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. I don't know what that means, Your Grace. I came here with nothing but my own name and no memory of where it came from. But I think you know something about my mother that I do not, and I think Lady Calderon knows it too, and I would very much like to understand why that frightens both of you. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marcella began to regret the question entirely, certain she had overstepped in some unforgivable way, certain she would be dismissed from the household by nightfall for daring to speak so plainly to a duke. But when Killian finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, and carried none of the cold formality he usually wrapped around himself like a second coat. My sister, he said, did not die of fever. Marcella's breath caught. I have suspected it for 2 years and had no proof, no body to examine, nothing but my father's word and a coffin sealed before I was permitted to see what lay inside it. He crossed back to the desk, opened the small drawer beneath it, not the locked one, she realized, but a different drawer entirely, and withdrew a miniature portrait, worn soft at the edges from handling. He held it out to her, and Marcella took it with hands that weren't entirely steady. The girl in the portrait could not have been older than 17. Dark curling hair, a wide, generous mouth caught mid-laugh by whatever artist had painted her, and eyes, pale gray, unusual, striking, that Marcella recognized instantly, because she had seen those same eyes every morning of her life, staring back at her from whatever broken mirror or still water happened to be nearby. Her own eyes. "Your Grace," Marcella whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Who is this?" "Lady Undine Ashgrave, my sister." Killian's jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on Marcella's face with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly, dangerously small. "Born the same year, I believe, that your mother is recorded as having left this region. Disappeared, more accurately, though the household records of the time call it something gentler." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I do not yet know what to make of the resemblance in your eyes, Miss Alaric. I have told myself for 2 years that grief was making me see ghosts where none existed, but I do not believe in coincidence enough to dismiss this as one." Marcella's hands trembled as she held the portrait, her own face, impossibly, unmistakably, staring back at her from beneath a stranger's curls and a stranger's gown, painted years before she had been born, or so she had always believed. "This is not possible," she said, though even as she said it, some old, buried part of her recognized that it was. The fragments of her mother's life had always been incomplete, deliberately so, full of silences her mother had refused to fill even on her deathbed. "Some things are safer left buried," her mother had said once, the only time Marcella had ever pressed her about the family they didn't have. "Promise me you'll never go looking for what was taken from us. It will only get you killed." "I want to believe it isn't," Killian said quietly. "But I have spent 2 years suspecting my own father sealed an empty coffin to hide a truth he could not afford to let the world see. And now a girl with my sister's eyes and a fragment of my sister's vanished mother's history walks into my dining hall asking to eat my leftovers." His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last words, the first true crack Marcella had seen in him since the night they'd met. "Tell me honestly, Miss Alaric, does that sound like a coincidence to you?" Before she could answer, the study door opened without warning, and Lady Faustine Calderon stood framed in the doorway, her gaze moving with cold precision from the Duke's face to Marcella's, to the small portrait trembling in Marcella's hands, and whatever composure she usually wore like a second skin cracked, just for an instant, into something close to panic. "Killian," she said, her voice tight. "What is she holding?" The days that followed moved like a held breath. Killian gave Marcella no formal answers, made no announcement, took no action that might have alerted the wider household to the suspicion now lodged immovably between them. But everything between them had shifted, the careful distance of master and servant, collapsing into something neither of them named aloud, but both of them felt. Every time their eyes met across a room, every time his hand brushed hers passing a ledger or a teacup, every lingering moment that stretched a half-second longer than propriety strictly required, he began finding reasons to keep her near him. A letter that needed careful transcription, a ledger that required a second pair of eyes, a walk through the East Gardens that he claimed was for the benefit of clearing his mind, though Marcella noticed he never once looked at the gardens, only at her. "You're staring again, Your Grace," she said one evening, as they walked the gravel path beneath the last gold light of sunset, her voice carrying the dry, careful humor that had become, somehow, the safest language between them. "I'm aware," he said, not bothering to deny it. "I find I cannot seem to stop. That is a dangerous thing for a duke to admit to a maid. It is a dangerous thing for a duke to feel toward anyone," he said, and something in his voice had gone low, rough, unguarded in a way that made her pulse quicken despite every warning Mrs. Brennick had given her. "I have spent my entire life being told what I owe this family, this title, this house. I have never once been asked what I wanted for myself." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully, the gravel path empty around them, the last of the day's light catching gold in his dark eyes. "I find that what I want, increasingly, has very little to do with duty, and a great deal to do with you." Marcella's breath caught. "Your Grace, Killian, he said softly. When we are alone, I would like you to call me Killian. That is not appropriate. No, he agreed, stepping closer. Close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cooling evening air. Close enough that every careful boundary she'd built around herself in 8 months of service threatened to dissolve entirely. It isn't. I find I no longer care. He did not kiss her. Not that evening. But his hand found hers in the gathering dusk, fingers lacing through fingers with a gentleness that contradicted every cold rumor the household whispered about him, and they stood together in the garden in silence, the unspoken question of what they were to each other hanging between them, unanswered but no longer entirely unwelcome. It was Lady Faustine who broke the silence, 3 days later, in the cruelest way available to her. Marcella was summoned to the housekeeper's office on a gray Thursday morning to find not only Mrs. Brennick waiting, but 2 unfamiliar men in the dark coats of constabulary officers, and Lady Faustine Calderon, standing near the window with an expression of carefully arranged sorrow that did not reach her eyes. Marcella Alaric, one of the officers said, consulting a small leather notebook, "You are accused of the theft of a sapphire brooch belonging to Lady Faustine Calderon, valued at no less than £300, discovered this morning concealed within your personal effects in the servants' quarters." The room tilted. I have stolen nothing in my life, I swear it on my mother's grave." "The brooch was found in your room, girl," Mrs. Brennick said, and for the first time since Marcella had known her, the older woman's composure had cracked into something that looked almost like grief. "Beneath your mattress. I saw it pull out by myself. Someone placed it there." Marcella's voice rose, panic clawing up her throat. "I never owned anything of that value in my life. My lady knows I have never been anywhere near her jewels. I am terribly sorry it has come to this," Lady Faustine said, her voice soft, sympathetic, devastating in its falseness. "I had hoped, when I first noticed the brooch missing, that it was simply misplaced. I did not wish to believe a member of this household capable of such a betrayal. But the evidence, I'm afraid, speaks for itself. You put it there." Marcella's eyes burned with furious, helpless tears. "You know I never touched it. You're doing this because of the Duke." "That is quite enough," the second officer said sharply, taking Marcella's arm. "You will come with us now, and the matter will be resolved through proper channels. Wait." The voice came from the doorway, low and absolutely lethal, and every person in the room turned to find Killian standing there, his expression carved from something colder and harder than Marcella had seen even in their first meeting. "Release her." "Your Grace," the first officer said carefully, "the evidence." "The evidence," Killian said, crossing the room with slow, deliberate menace, "was placed in that room by someone who wished to see Miss Alaric removed from this household by any means necessary. I will not pretend to be ignorant of who might have motive for such a thing." His eyes cut to Lady Faustine, and the look he gave her could have frozen the summer sun. "Faustine, a word, now." "Killian, you cannot seriously be suggesting—" "I am suggesting precisely that, and I would advise you to consider very carefully how this conversation proceeds, because the alternative is a public investigation into the provenance of that brooch, who last handled it, and who had access to the servants' quarters in the hours before it was conveniently discovered." His voice had gone dangerously quiet. The iron control Marcella had only glimpsed before now fully, terrifyingly present. "I do not believe you want that investigation conducted, my lady. I do not believe it would end favorably for you." Lady Faustine's composure finally, fully cracked. "You would choose a maid over the woman your family arranged for you to marry? Over the alliance that secures this entire estate?" "I would choose the truth," Killian said, "over a lie wearing your face, every single time." The room fell utterly silent. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unwilling to arrest a maid the Duke himself was defending with such open ferocity, and Mrs. Brennick had gone pale, her eyes darting between the Duke and Lady Faustine as though watching the foundations of the entire household shift beneath her feet. "Release Miss Alaric," Killian said again, quieter now, but no less absolute. "The matter is closed. If the brooch is truly missing, I will personally fund its replacement and consider the matter resolved. There will be no arrest in my house today." The officers released Marcella's arm. She stood trembling in the center of the room, her pulse still racing, the weight of what had nearly happened to her. What would have happened without the Duke's intervention, settling into her bones like ice? Lady Faustine's eyes found hers one final time before she swept from the room, and the look she gave Marcella was no longer cold calculation. It was pure, undisguised hatred, the kind that promised this was not over, that whatever had just been thwarted would simply return in a different, crueler shape. "This isn't finished," Lady Faustine said, low enough that only Marcella could hear. "You have made an enemy today, Miss Alaric, far more dangerous than a duke's affection can protect you from." That night, Killian found Marcella in the East Garden, where she'd fled after the household had finally slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms, needing air, needing distance from the eyes that had watched the morning's events unfold, and would surely spend the evening whispering about them. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, before he'd even fully crossed the gravel path toward her. "Defending me like that, in front of the officers, in front of her. You've made a powerful enemy on my account. I made an enemy of someone who tried to send an innocent woman to prison rather than admit she'd lost something she never deserved to keep in the first place." His voice was rough, the careful control of the morning finally giving way to something rower underneath. "Marcella, I cannot keep pretending that what I feel for you is some passing curiosity. I have spent every day since you sat at my table thinking of nothing else. I do not know what you are to my family, sister, cousin, some thread of blood, I do not yet understand, but I know what you are to me, and I am done pretending otherwise for the sake of an arrangement I never wanted." Killian. His name in her mouth felt like a confession of its own. "If I am somehow connected to your family, if I am truly your sister or some piece of her, then what you're describing is not possible. It would be monstrous." "I don't believe that's the truth," he said quietly. "I think someone wanted us to believe it was, to keep us apart, to keep whatever secret your mother carried, buried where it couldn't threaten the arrangement my father built his entire legacy around. I think Faustine's family has known something about your mother's disappearance for longer than either of us has been alive, and I think the locket she refuses to remove holds the proof of it." Marcella's heart was pounding. "Then we need to see what's inside it." "Yes," Killian said, "we do. And I think I know exactly how to make that happen, though it will mean putting both of us in considerably more danger than we already are." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small brass key, holding it up between them in the moonlight. "The locked drawer in my study. I never told you what it contains because I did not yet trust what you would do with the knowledge. I trust you now." His eyes held hers, steady, certain. "Inside that drawer is my father's final correspondence with a solicitor in the eastern provinces, the same provinces your mother came from. I have never had the courage to read it in full. I think it's time we read it together." The study was dark when they entered it, lit only by a single candle Killian carried, the rest of the household long since retired for the night. He knelt at the small cabinet, the brass key trembling slightly in his hand. The first sign of genuine fear Marcella had seen from him since the morning's confrontation, and turned the lock with a soft, final click. Inside lay a single bundle of letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon that had once, perhaps, been blue. Killian's hands shook as he untied them. The first letter, written in a cramped, urgent hand, was dated nearly 20 years earlier. "My lord, the girl has been removed from the estate as instructed, and the household has been told the fever took her in the night. I have arranged for her to be placed with a family in the western counties under an assumed name, as you required, though I must repeat my objection to this course of action. She is innocent of any wrongdoing. The crime, if it can be called that, belongs entirely to her mother's blood, not to the child herself. I pray you reconsider before it is too late to undo what has been set in motion." Marcella read the words twice before their meaning fully landed, and when it did, the floor seemed to drop away beneath her entirely. "Killian," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "This isn't about your sister. This is about me." He looked up from the letter, his face white in the candlelight, and in his eyes she saw the same vertiginous understanding settling over him that had just settled over her. That whatever truth this house had buried 20 years ago, whatever lie had been constructed to protect his father's legacy, Marcella herself was not merely connected to it, she was its center. "There's a second letter," Killian said, his voice barely above a whisper, lifting a page that had been folded separately from the rest, sealed with wax that had never been broken. "It's addressed to whoever opens this drawer after my father's death." His hands trembled as he broke the seal. "It's in his own handwriting." He read in silence for a long moment, his face draining of all color, and when he finally looked up at Marcella, the candlelight caught something in his expression that frightened her more than anything Lady Faustine had said or done. What does it say? Marcella's voice cracked. Killian, what does it say? It says, he said slowly, that the woman the household believed died of fever 20 years ago. The girl in that portrait, the girl with your eyes, did not die at all. He set the letter down with hands that would not stop shaking. It says she was sent away in disgrace, carrying a child my father refused to acknowledge as legitimate, and that the child was placed with a stranger under a false name to protect the family's reputation. His eyes lifted to hers, raw and disbelieving and full of something that looked, impossibly, like hope tangled with horror in equal measure. Marcella, I think Undine Ashgrave was not my sister who died of fever. I think she is the mother you've spent your entire life mourning. I think the woman my father exiled from this house in shame was your mother, and that makes you not some distant resemblance, not some strange coincidence of blood. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling as they closed around hers, his voice breaking entirely on the final words. It makes you my niece, Marcella, the rightful heir to everything Faustine Calderon's family has spent 20 years scheming to steal. Somewhere beyond the study door, a floorboard creaked, soft, deliberate, the sound of someone who had been listening far, longer than either of them realized, and before Killian could move, before Marcella could even draw breath to ask who was there. The study door swung open to reveal Lady Faustine standing in the threshold, her face no longer composed, no longer cold, but lit with something far more dangerous than either of them had ever seen from her. "So," she said softly, "you finally found it." "So," Lady Faustine said again, stepping fully into the study, the candlelight catching the gold chain at her throat, the locket, Marcella realized, finally visible above her collar, as though Faustine no longer cared to hide it. "You finally found it. 20 years, and a starving maid undoes what an entire family worked so carefully to bury. Faustine." Killian's voice was low, dangerous, the letter still clutched in his white-knuckled hand. "Tell me what you know, all of it, now. You want the truth?" Faustine's laugh was brittle, humorless, the careful mask she'd worn for years finally, fully cracking apart. "The truth, Killian, is that your father was a coward who would rather exile his own daughter than admit she'd shamed him, and my family was more than happy to help him do it. For a price." Her fingers closed around the locket at her throat. "My grandmother arranged the placement, the false papers, the solicitor who carried that girl away in the night and told the household she'd died of fever. In exchange, our families were bound together. Your father's silence about what really happened to Undine, in exchange for a betrothal that would tie the Calderon fortune to the Ashgrave name for the next generation. Me, Killian. I was the price your father paid for his secret. I have spent my entire life being groomed to marry you, not because either of our families believed in love, but because your father needed insurance against a secret unraveling, and mine needed your title to rebuild a fortune we'd already half spent securing it." "And the locket?" Marcella's voice came out steadier than she felt. "What's inside it?" Faustine's hand trembled slightly as she unclasped the chain, holding the small gold oval out toward them with something that looked, for the first time, almost like exhaustion rather than malice. "Open it yourself, if you doubt me." Killian took it. His fingers found the small clasp, and the locket sprang open to reveal a tiny portrait, not of Faustine, not of any Calderon, but of the same gray-eyed girl from the miniature in his desk drawer, painted younger, perhaps 15, her smile wide and unguarded, in a way that made Marcella's chest ache with a grief she hadn't known she carried for a mother she barely remembered. "My grandmother kept it," Faustine said quietly, "as proof, insurance of her own, in case your father ever tried to break the arrangement once the scandal had faded from memory. She gave it to me before she died, told me to wear it always, to never let it out of my sight. A reminder," she said, "of exactly what kept our families bound together, and exactly what would unravel if anyone ever learned the truth." Her eyes lifted to Marcella's, and something in them had shifted, the hatred of the morning replaced by something far more complicated. "I did not know there was a child. I swear that to you. I have hated you on instinct since the night Killian gave you his dinner, because some part of me always sensed you belonged here in a way I never truly did. But I did not know why, not until tonight. You tried to have me arrested," Marcella said. "You planted a brooch in my room knowing it could have sent me to prison." "Yes." Faustine did not look away from the admission, did not soften it with excuses. "I am not proud of it. I was frightened and angry, and watching the only thing my entire life had been built around slip away from me in real time, and I made a choice I cannot undo." She drew a breath, steadying herself. But I will not compound that choice by helping bury the truth a second time. Whatever debt I owe for what I tried to do to you, I intend to begin repaying it tonight. What do you mean? Killian asked, his voice taut with suspicion that had not yet fully faded. I mean, Faustine said, that my father is in the house. He arrived an hour ago, unannounced, asking for a private audience with you regarding the wedding contracts. I believe he intends to accelerate the marriage before either of you can act on whatever you've just discovered. He has always been the more ruthless of the two of us, Killian, and if he learns what you now know before you're prepared to act on it, I do not believe either of you will survive the consequences of his desperation. Lord Calderon was waiting in the great hall when the three of them descended, his expression carrying the particular impatience of a man accustomed to being kept waiting by no one, his eyes sweeping over Marcella with open, undisguised contempt the moment she appeared at Killian's side. Killian. Lord Calderon did not bother with pleasantries. I had hoped to discuss the wedding contracts privately, but I see you've brought company. His gaze flicked to Marcella again, colder this time. The maid, I presume, that half the household has been whispering about. I would advise you to remember your obligations, your grace, before sentiment costs you everything your father built. My father, Killian said, his voice carrying an iron calm that made the air in the hall feel suddenly colder, built his legacy on the exile of his own daughter and the theft of her child's birthright. I have just finished reading the proof of it, Lord Calderon, in his own handwriting, alongside the solicitor's correspondence detailing exactly how your family helped him accomplish it. The color drained from Lord Calderon's face just for a moment, before he recovered himself with the practiced composure of a man who had spent decades learning to mask fear with authority. I don't know what fiction you've convinced yourself of, Your Grace, but I would caution you against repeating it publicly. Accusations against my family carry consequences. Legal consequences. Consequences that could see this entire estate dragged through scandal and ruin before a single court in the realm. Then let it be dragged through the scandal, Killian said. I would rather see every secret this house has buried laid bare in open court than spend one more day pretending Marcella Alaric is not exactly who she is, the rightful daughter of Killian Ashgrave, and the rightful heir to everything your family has spent 20 years scheming to keep from her. You would destroy your own family's name for a maid? I would destroy a lie, Killian said, to make room for the truth. There is a difference, my lord, and I am surprised a man from your station has spent so long failing to understand it. Lord Calderon's composure finally cracked entirely, fury replacing the careful mask he'd worn into the hall. You foolish boy, do you have any idea what you're threatening to unravel? Your father's reputation, this family's standing at court, every alliance, every debt, every arrangement built on the assumption that this secret would stay buried. I am not threatening to unravel it, Killian said quietly. I am unraveling it, tonight, and you will not stop me, my lord, because the moment you raise a hand against either of us, you confirm in front of witnesses exactly what your family has spent 20 years trying to hide. For a long, tense moment, Lord Calderon said nothing at all, his eyes moving between Killian's unyielding expression and his daughter's pale, resolute face, clearly recalculating the odds of a fight he had not expected to find himself losing. Faustine, he said finally, his voice tight with barely restrained rage, you will come with me. Now, we will discuss the consequences of your betrayal privately. No, Faustine said. The single word landed in the hall like a thunderclap. Lord Calderon turned to face his daughter fully, disbelief carved into every line of his face, as though the possibility of her defiance had simply never occurred to him. I have spent my entire life, Faustine said, her voice shaking but steady, being told who to marry, what to want, how to smile at a man who never once looked at me the way he looks at her. Her eyes flicked briefly to Marcella, something almost like an apology in them. I am done being your insurance policy, father. Whatever consequences come from the truth, I would rather face them honestly than spend another year of my life propping up a lie that was never mine to begin with. Lord Calderon's face contorted with fury, but before he could respond, the great doors at the end of the hall swung open, and a contingent of royal guard, summoned, Marcella would later learn, by Mrs. Brennick herself, who had overheard enough of the evening's events to understand exactly what was at stake, filed into the room, led by a magistrate Killian had clearly sent for hours earlier, the moment the truth in his father's letters had first become clear to him. Lord Calderon, the magistrate said, You are required to answer formal inquiry regarding the falsification of household records and the unlawful concealment of a legitimate heir's birthright, as detailed in correspondence provided this evening by His Grace, Duke Killian Ashgrave. This is absurd, Lord Calderon snapped, though his voice carried the unmistakable tremor of a man who finally understood he had lost. You cannot possibly— I can, Killian said, and I have. The letters are authenticated in my father's own hand, witnessed by myself, by Lady Calderon, and by Miss Alaric herself. The matter will proceed through proper legal channels, my lord, exactly as it should have 20 years ago. The guards escorted Lord Calderon from the hall, his protests echoing off the marble, until the great doors closed behind him, and silence settled over the room like snowfall, heavy, sudden, almost peaceful in its aftermath. Faustine remained behind, standing very still in the center of the hall, watching her father's departure with an expression that held grief and relief in equal measure. What happens to me now? She asked quietly, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel unbearable. I helped my father deceive this house, even before I understood the full truth of it. I do not expect mercy. Killian was quiet for a long moment, his hands still wrapped protectively around Marcella's. You came to me tonight with the truth, he said finally, when you could have stayed silent and let your father finish what he started. That matters, Faustine, even if it doesn't undo what came before. He paused. The betrothal has ended. That much will not change. But I will not see you punished for sins that were planted in you before you were old enough to refuse them. Go where you wish. Build whatever life you choose. I only ask that you do it honestly, from this day forward. Faustine's eyes glistened, and for the first time since Marcella had known her, the careful, cold composure dissolved entirely into something raw and grateful and young. Thank you, she whispered, and then, turning to Marcella, added, quieter still, I am sorry. For all of it. I hope, in time, you might believe that. I believe it, Marcella said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow, careful unburying, the household records corrected, the magistrate's inquiry concluding with full legal recognition of Marcella Alaric as the daughter of Lady Killian Ashgrave, and the rightful heir to a portion of the estate her grandfather had tried so desperately to deny her. The staff who had once whispered about a starving maid now bowing their heads to a lady whose birthright had finally, fully come to light. Marcella found her mother's grave, empty, as the letters had promised, a hollow monument to a lie 20 years old, and stood beside it on a gray morning with Killian's hand in hers, grieving not the death that had never happened, but the 20 years of exile her mother had endured in silence, the life she might have lived had the truth been allowed to breathe. She would have been proud of you, Killian said quietly, as they stood together in the cold morning light. Whatever she suffered, whatever she lost, she raised a daughter who walked into a duke's dining hall, starving and still asked permission before she touched what wasn't hers. That tells me everything I need to know about the woman who raised you. Marcella's eyes burned with tears. She finally allowed herself to shed. I used to think my mother's silence was shameful, she said. I understand now it was protection. She knew exactly what this house was capable of, and she spent every year of my life trying to keep me far enough away that I'd never have to find out. And yet here you are. Killian turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had only begun to see in the weeks since that first candlelit dinner. I have asked myself many times since that night what it was about you that undid every careful wall I had built around myself. I think now that I finally understand the answer. He reached for her hands, holding them between his own with a tenderness that made her breath catch. You asked nothing of me, Marcella, even when you had every right to. You showed me honesty in a house built on lies, and somewhere in the months since, that honesty became the only thing I trusted in my entire life. Killian, I love you, he said simply, the words carrying none of the formal distance a duke might be expected to wrap around such a confession, only the plain, unguarded truth of a man who had finally stopped pretending otherwise. I do not care what the courts decide about inheritance or titles or the proper order of things. I have known since the night I gave you my plate that I would spend the rest of my life trying to earn the kind of honesty you gave me without even meaning to. Marry me. Not because it solves some political arrangement, not because it settles an inheritance dispute, but because I cannot imagine spending another day of my life without you beside me. Marcella's tears finally spilled over, though they carried none of the grief of moments before, only a fierce, overwhelming joy that felt, after a lifetime of hunger and hiding, like finally being fed in every sense that mattered. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like the truest thing she had ever spoken. "Yes, Killian, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, beside her mother's empty grave, beneath a gray sky that seemed, in that moment, to soften into something gentler, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of the estate's small chapel began to ring, as though the house itself, finally unburdened of the secret it had carried for 20 long years, had found its voice again at last. Their wedding, when it came that spring, was nothing like the cold, arranged affair the household had once whispered about in fearful tones. The chapel overflowed with staff who had once been forbidden from looking a duke's bride too directly in the eye, now weeping openly as Marcella walked the aisle in a gown that had been her mother's, carefully preserved and altered by Greta's own steady hands. Faustine attended, seated near the front, her presence no longer a source of tension but a quiet testament to the strange, unlikely grace that can follow even the deepest betrayals when both parties choose honesty over bitterness. Mrs. Brennick wept through the entire ceremony, insisting afterward it was simply dust in her eyes, though no one in the household believed her, nor cared to challenge the lie. And when Killian finally lifted Marcella's veil, his hands as unsteady as they had been the night he'd first shown her the portrait of a sister he'd believed dead, he did not speak of duty, or legacy, or the careful arrangements that had once governed every choice available to a man of his station. He simply looked at her, truly looked at her, the way he had looked at her that very first night, across a plate of cold pheasant in a candlelit hall, and said the only words that mattered. "Welcome home." Marcella Alaric, who had once asked permission to eat a stranger's leftovers because hunger had stripped away every ounce of pride she had left, became that day not merely a duchess, but the living proof that the truths a family tries hardest to bury are very often the truths that save it in the end. That dignity is not erased by hunger, nor birthright stolen by silence, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply ask, honestly, for what they need, and trust that the answer might be kinder than the world has taught them to expect. If this story moved you the way I hope it did, I'd love for you to take a moment and hit that subscribe button, drop a comment below telling me which moment hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs a reminder today that the truth always finds its way home, no matter how long it's been buried. Whatever hunger you're carrying right now, for belonging, for recognition, for someone to finally see you clearly, I hope this story reminds you that asking for what you need is never a weakness. It is, very often, the first brave step toward the life that was always meant to be yours. Thank you for staying with Marcella and Killian until the very end. I'll see you in the next story, The Royal Duke Diaries.